Welcome back. We're at Roman numeral 3. Roman numeral 3, African slave trade and imperialism. This will be the last video that we do for this week. With Easter just around the corner, you've got Good Friday off. Then you'll get an opportunity to enjoy a 4-day weekend. Won't be coming back till next Tuesday. Pray that you all will have a safe time and enjoyable Easter weekend. If you're not able to go to church, I hope that you'll all be able to either tune into the radio or go online and listen to a sermon preaching about the gospel, or if least case scenario, if you could just read the resurrection sermon, resurrection message in the Bible itself, just to help us to remember what this whole Easter season is all about. Anyways, back to the notes. Roman numeral 3. As previously discussed, Africa did have civilizations before Europe showed up. They'd even established trade relations with Europe and Asia. But by the 1800s, Europe's imperialism no longer had room for trading partners, but rather subjects. Europe's conquest of Africa would be a mix between exploitation, like the slave trade, and humanitarian aid, like missions work. So let's begin. Letter A, the African slave trade. The exploration of Africa and discovery of the Americas indirectly prompted the rise of the slave trade. In 1441, Portugal began this by bringing a few Africans to Europe. But black slavery did not become common until the Spanish began to purchase them in large numbers. The Native Americans could not handle the strenuous work of the plantation life, so the Spanish began purchasing Africans instead. From 1700 to 1850, this was when the slave trade was most prevalent. The slave trade proved to be very profitable for some and expanded rapidly. It is estimated that about 9.5 million African slaves were brought over to the Americas and Europe. The slave trade will die out between 1870 and 1880. Recognize that slave traders often bought them from other blacks on the coast. Slave traders rarely captured their own slaves. Africans enslaving Africans had been a common practice for centuries. Victorious chiefs would enslave a defeated village. With the arrival of the Europeans, Africans now had a new market to sell their captured prisoners to. Sadly, about 1/4 of all slaves that left Africa died during the voyage across the Atlantic. Some of you guys may remember it being called the Middle Passage. Slave traders only purchased the strongest and healthiest slaves because the weak and sick would likely die on the voyage over. A slave was placed into a compartment similar to a casket, where he would remain bound for nearly the entire voyage, which lasted about 3 weeks. Hope you're not claustrophobic. Contaminated food and water contributed to illness and death. Letter B. Opening up the interior. Before the 19th century, few Europeans had ever explored the interior of Africa. It was the unknown land. It was nicknamed the Dark Continent for its mystery. One of the most famous explorers of Africa during this time was David Livingstone, 1813-1873. He was one of the first explorers inland. He did so because he wanted to open up Africa to the gospel, and he wanted to end the slave trade. He explored the interior of Africa. During one of his expeditions, he was gone so long, people began wondering if he was even still alive. In order to find out, the British sent newspaper expeditions to find him. You probably remember this bit of history. Henry Stanley's famous Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Stanley led an expedition that found him, greeting him with that famous line. Livingstone continued traveling and preaching until his death about 2 years later. His work created great enthusiasm for missions in Britain and in the U.S. Other missionaries came to Africa, explorers opened up the interior, and European trade and imperialism gained control. In your books on page 427, there's a box that I want you guys to read to yourselves entitled David Livingstone and Mary Slessor in Africa. Please read that to yourself. Once you have finished, unpause the video and continue. Letter C, Imperialism in Africa. It was known as the Scramble. It took place between 1880 and 1914. The European powers made a mad dash to claim control parts of Africa. So the Scramble, if you need a definition, it was just Europe's mad dash to claim control over parts of Africa. Before this time, about 10% of the land was claimed by Europe. By 1914, there was very little left of Africa unclaimed. If you look at page 429, it shows you a map of Africa, and it shows you the areas of Africa that were claimed and what countries claimed them. Let's briefly, just like we did with Southeast Asia, let's briefly talk about the areas that were claimed by certain countries. The British gained control of Egypt, but more importantly, they gained control of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, of course, was the water route, the man-made water route between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. Now, ships could travel through those waters rather than having to go all the way around Africa to get to Asia. If you look on page 440, just kidding. Let's move on. Another individual was a guy by the name of Cecil Rhodes. Cecil John Rhodes and Southern Africa. Rhodes, a nickname that you guys need to associate with Cecil Rhodes, is the Empire Builder. He was known as the Empire Builder. He favored British imperialism and hoped to unite Cairo to Cape Town with British colonies. Looking at the map, you can see, of course, how most of it will be united along the eastern side from Egypt down to South Africa. While only partially successful, he did establish Britain's control over most of the region. The future countries of Zambia and Zimbabwe were originally called Rhodesia, named in his honor. French colonies. Before we get to the colonies itself, the Foreign Legion was an elite army group that specialized in African imperialism. That's the thing you need to know about Foreign Legion. This army arrived in Algeria and expanded from there. In short, the French colony included most of West Africa. In fact, it became the largest land empire in Africa, although most of it was desert. You can see again on the map the area of West Africa. Belgium, if you're following along in your notes, it's just parallel to British colonies, French colonies, and now we have Belgian colony. The main man responsible for establishing a Belgian colony was King Leopold II of Belgium, who established the Congo. Leopold II of Belgium paid explorers to claim as much of the interior of Africa as they could for him. The result was the Congo, which, by the way, is about 75 times the size of Belgium. However, when news leaked out how Leopold was treating the native population, the Belgian government took possession of the colony and it became known as the Belgian Congo. Germany also well established. They came late onto the scene of African colonization, mostly because it wasn't a country until 1871. Karl Peters is the main man responsible for establishing German colonies, and he will establish Southwest Africa, future Namibia, and East Africa, future Tanzania. German Southwest Africa was Germany's first colony. Karl Peters secured the geographically important German East Africa, not for any use of resources or anything like that, but mostly to prevent Britain from achieving its north to south connection of Africa. Lastly, we'll talk about independent lands. As you all remember, Siam was the only land in Southeast Asia to keep its independence. Over, as you can see on the map on 429, 2 territories managed to keep their independence, Liberia and Ethiopia. By 1914, only these 2 countries remained independent of European control. Liberia had been established as a slave-free country by the U.S. for returning slaves. Ethiopia was invaded by Italy, but because of tough terrain and Italian problems, Ethiopia was able to resist and remain independent. That's all the notes that we're going to cover for today. For your homework, this is the last assignment that you need to get done to turn in with your packet information. It's found on pages 169, 170, and 175 in your activities book. Please do those 3 assignments. Page 169 is a reading section over the middle passage. Please answer the 4 questions found there. And then page 175 is another map for you guys to do over Africa. Hope you all have a good Easter weekend. Make sure you seek to honor and glorify God in all that you do. Be good, do good. Bye.